Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me as always is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, we are still in Genesis 3:16. We're going to look at the last part of the verse, just in case, though I probably should read it to refresh for people and ourselves. And it says, "To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." All right. So we last time discussed the pain, right, in the childbirth, that aspect of this verse. So for here, I think we want to take a moment to say something about this final phrase in this verse, which is where we most often see this brought up in terms of discussing the idea of husband and wives, right? But after we're done with these sections here where God talks to the woman and then the man, I think we'll deal with the man woman marriage context, husband wives, all of that stuff kind of in one chunk when we get to sort of the end of this. But we have been talking thus far about the idea of the masculine and the feminine, right? And so this being sort of spoken as a description to the feminine perspective, right? And so I think we want to deal with that sort of deeper spiritual perspective first here, and show how these things kind of are meant to work. The first kind of before creation is marred by sin, and then what it looks like with the dynamic of sin present. So first of all, the word here that's used, and this is interesting, it's actually just the singular for man, and only 4 other times do we see it translated as husband, but all those times are in the first person. And so this is the only time it's in this second person perspective here. So really it's often translated my man is really what husband means, which is interesting in that Hebrew translation. So once again, the fact that it's there's a translation choice here being made by using the term husband that is different than all the other times we see this, right? All those other times are first person. They're saying my man, husband. This is the only time we choose to translate it instead of man as husband from a second person perspective.
Okay. So typically when you're saying first person, you're saying that a woman is referring to somebody as their man.
Yeah. What the times that it's translated as husband,
that's what's being said.
Yes.
And then with the second person, it's typically just referencing man, just like as a male, which connects more to what we've been exploring as masculine rather than just this relationship between the relationship between a biological male and a biological female
within marriage too,
within marriage, which is I guess extended here to that. Okay, that's interesting.
So that's a translation choice that has been made. That's kind of interesting,
right? I wonder if that goes back. Does that go back like all the way to like the King James version? Does that go? I'm curious if that goes back all the way to like the Latin Vulgate. Because a lot of times those things inform decisions. Whether that's going to be the case,
right? Or the Septuagint even. Might have a role to play in that. I don't know. That's I would have to look into that. I'm not sure
that would have to be
worth looking that emerged.
Because that certainly changes the meaning of how we're going to read this.
It does. Yes.
Saying man is going to rule over you versus saying your husband is going to rule over you. That sets a total different precedent for how the church understandably would teach marriage.
Yes.
If that's in the first three chapters of the Bible, then that if that verse shows up, that feels like that's pretty significant, and that's the way you're supposed to structure marriage. But if it's changed, then that's a huge difference.
Yeah. And so that's one of those things where it's like, I mean, I'm sure there's a case to be made, for using husband there. And I'm sure, people make that. I don't think it's, founded upon nothing, but it is curious that it's this anomaly, I guess.
Yeah. And I think is this the first time we've seen husband said? Because before this,
Yeah, a
they've just
man
been
shall
translated.
leave his family and cleave unto his wife. So we did see wife there, but this is the
Yeah,
first time we see husband as a
we
term,
see husband used. Okay, that's interesting
at
too.
least
All
in
right.
the translation we're seeing it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
And then the word desire here, that is really interesting because it's used only two other times. And that is the next chapter we see it actually, and then in songs of Solomon or Song of Songs, or sometimes I've seen it just called Songs, but that book,
Yeah.
the one with many names, that
Yeah.
is the other place you see it as well. And that latter time, the desire there that's being described as a longing between lovers, right?
Okay.
And then the former, though, so this is the only other time in Genesis, it's describing sin waiting to ensnare Cain.
Oh,
When sin
okay.
is
When it
described
says it's like a
waiting
cat
at the
is
door.
crouching at your
Yeah,
door,
yeah,
something of
yeah.
that nature. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So that seems like quite a bit of range to this word here.
Yeah.
When you have the desire between lovers and then, sin trying to
Yeah.
ensnare him. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think it may be worthwhile to sort of consider that, right? Could the term here, as it's being used here, the term desire, could it be meant to try to capture both of those ideas at once, right?
Mhm.
The longing that you see in songs, and then the almost, I don't know what to call it, jealous desire maybe that you
Mhm.
see of sin in the next chapter, something like that. um
Well,
so
there's certainly this irresistibleness to the way those things that are being described. There's like this baseness, this you can't. It's the desire that bubbles up inside of you, independent of your own volition, if
yeah,
that makes
something
sense.
like that,
It's
yeah.
not something that's typically longing for a lover is something that's not typically like consciously initiated
Right, right, yeah,
especially in the
yeah.
way it's posed in Song of Songs. It's not that's not the type of love that's being described exactly. It's not that dedicated love that we like to talk about, like with a marriage that allows it to last for decades. It's this like thing that bubbles up inside of you, independent
Right,
of your own control. And the same thing with that desire of for sin, that resentment, that feeling. It just kind of appears inside of you.
yeah, yeah.
And so maybe that's what's this talking about in this desire for the man, I guess, is maybe the better translation. That's what
Right.
it's going to be. It's going to be uncontrollable. It's just going to appear inside. And so it's more of it's a statement of fact. It's like this is going to appear inside of you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and in a way, I think too, the point here is that what it's trying to say is that no matter how the feminine approaches the masculine, it's going to have this relationship with the masculine that comes, it falls somewhere on this spectrum of like the romantic yearning that you see in Song of Solomon, or the jealous yearning that you see in of the sin, right,
Mm-hmm.
for Cain.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the way the feminine sees the masculine, somewhere in that spectrum, right? And we could argue one end of that spectrum probably a little healthier than the other,
Mm-hmm.
but no matter what place it falls, the masculine, the other thing, in effect rules over it,
Mm-hmm.
almost because of that, right? Because if you're yearning for something in a romantic way, well, that thing kind of has authority or power or something over you in a way, right?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, if you're like the sin, jealously, wanting something or coveting something, almost is probably what we're seeing kind of described there. Same thing, right? That thing in effect has some kind of control over you, some power over you. It rules over you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the feminine aspect falls somewhere in this, and because of that, almost the masculine rules over it,
Mm-hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then we also need to look at the term for rule here, right? Because that seems important as well. It's not the same term that is used to describe man's dominion over the animals, which is interesting. Prior to this point, we see it used to describe the relationship between the sun and the moon and ruling day and night.
Okay.
And that's interesting because we might see who those bodies rule or dominion over. It's one centered around the provision of light in those circumstances, right? The rule of the sun and the moon over the day and night. It's about bringing light to those times, those situations. And if we remember back then, light is sort of a representation of God and God's order, right? And so day and night are kind of the full spectrum of states of being on the earth. And so you have this ruling over the bringing order to the full spectrum of what the earth can be. And so here we see that kind of reflected again, where it's the masculine provides kind of this guiding light in a way to the feminine in the full range of everything desire there could mean, if that makes sense. So it's like you could desire in the romantic way all the way to this sort of covetous way, but within that full range, the masculine rules over it the way the sun and moon rule over the night. And so there's this kind of like guiding, bringing of God's order and light to the innate nature of what the feminine idea is. So if we put it together, I guess what we see here then is like this dynamic where whether the feminine longs for the masculine as a lover or longs to almost bring it lower, right? Like sin waiting at the door in this jealous way. Again, this is like day or night, you could even say, with the day being the lover aspect of it, right? And the night being the sinful, chaotic aspect of it. The masculine will still preside over the feminine and provide a guiding light like the sun and the moon.
What I keep getting struck with is this, like the function of the masculine and feminine that we've kind of highlighted out, which feels to that seems to be crucial to me to how the masculine would rule over the feminine,
which we will why get more to in the next couple of verses here, right? Because God talks directly to the masculine. And so we'll get some more detail on that, but this is just like, I think, a general, like, this is the guiding light, right? In a way.
Well, we hinted at we talked about Adam being highly operational and highly pragmatic and highly not very imaginative,
right? And the masculine in general being that.
Exactly. And so there's this way in which if in the feminine being the imaginative and the creative and the things like and coming up with ideas, and that's why the feminine gives birth, and because it creates new things,
right?
But those new things are at the mercy of whoever's operating on that, whoever's putting something into effect,
into practice.
Exactly. And so I see that like the way in which the masculine would rule over the feminine is that whatever the feminine produces is at the mercy of whatever the masculine is putting into effect,
right?
And the reason it would desire for that is it wants to be operational and make things into effect, but the feminine is constantly coming up and creating new things.
Yes.
The only other thing that connects with this that I just want to briefly state is there's this now infamous interview between Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman, and there's a point in that conversation. If you haven't heard it, you can go listen to it. But there's this point in that conversation where Jordan Peterson is making this point that a lot of women opt out of positions in the workforce, in corporations and things like that, because they don't have an overabundance of masculine qualities, which are typically single-mindedness, a pointing towards a goal, and that's it. And I'm going to sacrifice everything in order to achieve that goal.
Right.
And then at this point, Kathy Newman's kind of exacerbated, and she just kind of says something that's probably like the most honest response to it but sounds a little silly, but she says, well, if that's the way corporations work, if they're founded on masculine ideas, why don't you found them on feminine ideas?
Right.
And so her idea is that, well, why don't you make it this place? And which is like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe that would work, but that wouldn't work because that's not the functional side. The feminine is the side that's coming up with new ideas.
Right.
But that's not what corporations are there for. And so you see, like, even modern feminism, getting women into the workplace, the point is that they're doing the same things. The argument is like a girl can do the same thing a man can do, or a woman can do the same thing a man can do. We can compete with them on the same level. And so it's like this desire, you can see that being played out to operate on the masculine operating system, saying let's be highly functional and let's sacrifice everything in order to do that. The problem is that the masculine isn't that. It's not that it's not that great, but it certainly isn't complete. It sacrifices everything in order to get just one single thing, whereas the feminine is far broader and looks at a whole picture. And
which is why the workforce has been made better by, and again, we've talked about how there's masculine and a feminine aspect within all of us, right?
Yes.
In different proportions. Generally, you're more likely to find a higher ratio of femininity in women and a higher ratio of masculinity in men. Not all the time. That's not a universal rule, though, right?
Yeah.
But in general, the addition of more women to the workforce has increased the feminine influence on business and everything and all that, and has roundly, I think, been generally a good thing, right? Yeah. It's led to, I think, increased innovation and imaginativeness and ways just in which things can be done.
I think has put the pressure on companies to balance
upon where, there's a limit upon, how far that should go, and then balanced with sort of the masculine perspective. And companies, I think, are trying to figure out that balance right now. And it's not the same for every company too, certain companies need more of a masculine influence within them, and others need more of a feminine influence. It just kind of depends on the circumstance, right? But yeah, but it can't be built around one singular perspective. And in the end, the thing we've talked about with the masculine, the idea of man being in their garden, just plugging away and unaware of what he was being handed.
Exactly.
Like, you need whatever that thing is to be it has to be the locomotive pulling everything else forward.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think the key with the word desire here in some ways is it's like, well, the feminine can either be almost like the romantic love supporting that locomotive, right? In a way, desiring for that locomotive to succeed, or like sin, wishing to, crouching,
sabotage,
looking to sabotage, usurp, replace, whatever and the point, I think, of the verse is, but in the end, the masculine's gonna kind of be in charge, so you're probably better off leaning towards the first, not the more covetous attitude. But that is the idea, is that the masculine ultimately ends up, being the thing that, guides wherever this thing is going, right? It pulls it. It's the locomotive moving the train forward.
Yeah.
It just is,
the masculine is the tendency within, and it's right that there's a mix of everything. You see men tending to do this more than women. Women seem less willing a lot of times to do this, probably wisely. The masculine is the tendency to want to be willing to sacrifice anything in order to achieve a single goal.
Right.
And so that's why it's the locomotive, because it won't look at anything else, and it will be purely pragmatic at looking at finishing something. That if directed in the right direction, that's a good thing. And that's where the feminine has to interact with it in order to direct it properly, you know?
Yeah, direct it,
but that's why
also not, again, not usurp it, which is weird. Because normally you think of whatever is directing is doing the ruling. But I think what's being described is something more like you have the masculine kind of above, like seeing that like long-term, here's where we need to go kind of thing. It's like the masculine sees where you need to get, in a way, because it does have that sort of singular focus. And so if you like think of it from a Christian perspective, right, our sort of like desire to be more Christ-like, right? It's like the masculine sees that's the goal, that's where we're headed, more like Christ. But then it is unable to produce the things that we need within us in order to be more like Christ. So it's dependent upon the feminine to like lead to those sort of rebirths, following the goal and the aim that the masculine is setting. And it's like it's feeding the locomotive that's going forward. It's giving it the fuel that keeps it going forward.
I see it as almost the opposite. I see it as almost the opposite, where the masculine can be given a task of be more like Christ, and then it will hyper focus and only focus on that thing to the detriment of anything else. It will only see the reality that gets it towards that. Whereas the feminine will be able to look at that goal, maybe like Christ is not as good of a one, but the feminine will be able to look at that goal and say like, yes, but you're having to burn down a lot of other things in order to get there. So you need to find a better way to get there, because this is important too. And this is important. And this is important. And that's why I would say like,
and that I think actually that's kind of the point, is that's sort of the danger of the feminine. Because like ultimately, as a Christian, our goal should just be to be like Christ. There is nothing else beyond that.
Well, let's present
death to self and life in Christ.
Let's present a different representation though, because let's take the man. The man just was told, "Don't eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil," and the man was told, "Here's the woman; she will be your helper here in the garden." And that's all he saw. And he never questioned anything beyond that. He never considered the possibility that the woman would betray him. So he was single-mindedly focused on whatever was given to him. He's going to follow that rule to the T.
Agreed.
Whereas if the feminine weren't tempted the way that she was, and then brought along kind of Adam, and Adam never would have, if Adam would have questioned, which had a better feminine influence in his mind, he would have been able to look at what Eve is doing and say, maybe it's possible that Eve can tempt me, or it's possible that she might be doing something that I shouldn't partake in. But he doesn't question anything. And so he just goes single-mindedly. So I'm trying to let me think of a better example. Like, let's say if an aspect of being like Christ is being trying to think of something that's good. Let's use something other than like Christ, because I think it would be better if it's like get healthy, be healthy in body. Well, if you're going to be healthy in body, you could do everything possible in order to be healthy in body, to the detriment of everything else in your life.
Sure.
So you could work out nonstop.
Yeah, but that's kind of my point, right? Is that ultimately getting healthy in body, that's like it's like a value of a lower order. It's like there is sort of an ultimate value at the top of the pyramid, right? And that ultimate value could be selfish, self-interested, or it could be Christ, right? I mean, for the Christian, it's supposed to be Christ. And so I guess my point is, like, yeah, you have those things lower on the pyramid. And the idea is those things should exist subservient, though, to that ultimate thing.
Mhm.
And I guess my point is that ultimate thing, that thing at the top of the pyramid, that is Christ, that needs to have almost the locomotive, like that is the direction we're going. And so then it's the job of the masculine to say, this is the aim that we're going. And the feminine, then it's the job of the feminine within us to sort of rebirth within us new perspectives, things, interpretations, creative things, whatever within us to serve that goal. However, to me, what you're describing, actually then saying, well, I'm going to focus just on the health thing, that is then that would be like the feminine usurping then the masculine in terms of that ultimate goal. And so if the masculine does properly rule over it, then the masculine is asking the question. This is where Adam, or the man in the garden, failed, right? We saw there the failure of the masculine. But if the masculine is doing that job properly, the aiming towards Christ, then it will ask of whatever the feminine produces, does this serve that aim or not?
See, that's what I think the feminine is. I think the usurping.
So I think the feminine is just the producer. It doesn't ask the question.
I think the usurping of the masculine would be the feminine looking at, let's say, physical health then and saying, physical health is terrible and tearing down the thing completely, as opposed to saying, no, place that in the proper place that it is, but understand that it's a part of a larger hierarchy.
Because
the feminine is imaginative.
But what are we told about why the woman takes the fruit? The woman doesn't take the fruit because this or that is terrible. It's because she sees the potential of something, the greatness that could be born out of taking this fruit.
Okay, that's potential. Then maybe what I'm speaking to is more resentment, which shows up with Cain.
Right. You do get resentment with Cain, but here it's about like the pull to sin for the feminine.
But the pull to sin was what was described for Cain. That's the word for desire. That's why I'm connecting it, because we're looking at this woman's desire for the masculine.
No, that wasn't Cain's desire for sin. That was sin's desire
for Cain. Yeah.
So sin's desire for Cain looks at Cain and again sees the potential, what I could do to that. Right? Now we know that what it would do to Cain is not good for Cain, but it does that same thing that the woman does, looks at the fruit and says, what I could do with that knowledge. And the sin looks at Cain and says, what I could do with that physical entity, that person, that whatever, that capacity that Cain as a person has, right?
Yeah.
And so that is what I'm saying. That's sort of the issue, is that the feminine can look at the masculine and say, what I could do with that if I were to have the masculine pursue whatever other thing I want to, and maybe sure, physical health or pleasure or whatever, right? To whatever the end is, that at the expense of that ultimate top of the pyramid goal of Christ. That would be that sort of the feminine trying to usurp it. So the masculine done rightly, which we saw it done incorrectly in the example of Adam, would be saying, what is this fruit? So in other words, within us, as the feminine produces new ideas or whatnot, that masculine aspect within us saying, what is this fruit? What's been rebirthed within us as a result of the feminine? Am I changing in the right ways? Am I going in the right direction? Right. And so that's that sort of ability to, as a person, stop every now and then. I mean, in some ways, this is what the Lord's Supper, I think, is about, is stopping and assessing yourself and saying, hold on. The things that I'm pursuing, the things that I'm doing in life, the things, the interests I have or whatever, is that serving this ultimate goal or not? Right? All of those things are birthed by the sort of feminine thing within us. And then the masculine needs to come and say, we're pursuing those things, but let's hold on for a second and ask, is that the fruit we should be eating? If that makes sense. All right. I think we finally figured it out. So what exactly we're trying to get at here. All right, so this verse, a lot is sort of captured in this verse, and I think much of what we said probably sounds unfamiliar to people and odd, but that's what we're here for. And there's a kind of a mystery, I think, to all of this too, right? Even in our discussion of how the feminine works and the masculine works, I think we both see very much that this verse is describing something about that, but the way those things work within us is somewhat mysterious. But that, especially the feminine, I would say, is the more mysterious aspect of us. And so for that reason, the next verse gets a bit easier in terms of the symbolic interpretation of it, because we'll now be dealing with the masculine. And it should be no surprise, based on even just this discussion, that the masculine is definitely much simpler than the feminine. There's a more straightforwardness there. So in terms of what God says to the man, we'll see something more straightforward. So yeah, join us next time. And until then, like, subscribe, review, and send us an email, unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you then. Thanks.